don't need a high-end designer or a lot of money to get a luxe look. Be your own interior designer.
This is Affordable Interior Design, the podcast.
Here's your host, Betsy Helmuth.
Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be back again with you this week. I am joined by a guest today. Andy Ciccone from the Prole's Almanac is here. He has his own podcast and a lot of interesting ideas, and I'm so excited to have you on today, Andy.
Thank you so much.
So let's kick it off by you introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your podcast and what you've got going on.
Sure. So my name is Andy. I host the Prole's Almanac as well as another podcast, Tomorrow Today. And the general idea is thinking about in both projects, on thinking about the future and what role we have as individuals and as communities in what the future looks like given the state of global affairs, we'll say. And our interest is primarily around the idea of what is community, how do we build community, and how does community pair with the non-human community around us? So the plants, the animals, and what responsibilities do we have in managing those local ecosystems?
Well, and I love the idea of how it all goes back to sort of home, right? And how we live, where we live, how we maintain the world around us. So that's where I really found a synergy between your show and this show, is kind of thinking about living and living at home in a more holistic way rather than just furniture and artwork. What else makes a home, and how can we foster some ideals through the way that we live? So how did you get interested in this idea of sort of, I know sometimes on your podcast you talk about homesteading, a lot of gardening. What got you into that?
So my parents are immigrants from southern Italy. When my dad came over, my grandfather had managed farmland there, like most people in like smaller towns. And that, if you go in any like city and you drive down the street and there's always that one house that's got like every square foot of it is like grapevines and these giant flowery bushes and things like that. That was basically where I grew up. It was like one of those types of houses.
Wow.
And that kind of as I got older, I kind of moved away from it, and then as I got older again, I returned to those ideals and understood a little bit better of why that was so important to my family. And the idea of how do we pair our goals, our interests, the things that make us care about things with the food systems around us comes out in a lot of different ways. So the one thing I like to use as an example when I talk about like finding place and time in your food is like why are we so obsessed as a culture with something like the fall? Like there's always the joke of like white girls loving like the pumpkin spice latte from Starbucks in the fall, and it's like why is that a big deal? And it's because a part of us is very aware that something is missing in the way we live, because traditionally people would eat based on the seasons and things like that. And that's been mostly taken away from us, with the exception of a handful of things, whether that's, specific foods that come out during fall or Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever it might be. There's only a handful of experiences where we really get that. And we kind of, I don't want to say go overboard with it, but it's pointing to something deeper that's missing in the way we relate with food and our ecology and the seasons around us.
We kind of crave going back to that seasonal rhythm that we now don't have, because we can get strawberries 365 days a year, even though they're only supposed to be here for a brief time.
Exactly. There's something we all understand, even if we can't articulate it, that's missing in the way we relate with food and our community and our identity. Especially here in the United States, we're this melting pot that I think people are very aware of. But the challenge of that is that there's this emptiness in that sense where we don't have those connections ancestrally. And when we do, they kind of get like transmogrified, the way like we think of like New Jersey Italians, not to pick on anyone in particular, but the way New Jersey Italians doesn't really reflect Italian culture. It's its own thing, and that's okay. But it's very different, and it's that sense of I want to belong to this identity, and how do I get there? And when you're not in that same place, where why does Italian culture have X, Y, and Z? Well, ultimately it's because people used to live much more locally, so your culture comes from the things that are available to you, whether that's the food, the resources, and things like that. And when you take that culture and stick it someplace else, it's hard to replicate because those things aren't connected anymore. And it's a really complicated, and by no means am I trying to say like I have the answers for these things, but I think these are the conversations that are really important when we start thinking about like local food movements, and how do I be a better steward of whether it's my front yard or a couple acres of woodlands or whatever it might be. How do I pair my personal identity, my background, my interests, and the needs of this location? How do I bring all these things together?
Well, and I think something you said is so interesting, and I'm kind of thinking about it as we're talking. But whether it's eating foods that are out of season, or being from a different culture. I'm French and I moved here to Westchester. And, I have little things that I try and do to maintain that heritage, but it's very Americanized. I make crepes for my daughter on Saturday. These little things. I speak a little bit of French to them, even though I speak fluently, just to expose them and have some books. But, it's not the same, right? And I think it's all because what I was thinking of when you were talking is about transportation. And it's all happened so recently that we were able to fly over here or take a ship over here, that we're able to bring these strawberries from other places to us any time of year, that we're able to grow in a different way that allows us to have off-season foods all year long. So I just think that you're right. These concepts are so new to us the last couple of maybe 100 years, whereas before there were thousands of years of us living a totally different way.
Yeah,
Right.
and
Having to live with the seasons, having to stay in localized communities because traveling long distances was really difficult and dangerous. So I think that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and to piggyback on that, traditionally, if you moved thousands of miles away, if you somehow managed to do it, you became very quickly absorbed into the culture of the place you went to.
Mm,
And you think about it, like I think about my own parents, and you couldn't just like Zoom, Skype somebody back in Italy. How are things going? Like, what's going on? You very quickly were basically cut off from that culture and the evolution of that culture. We tend to think of, especially when we talk about like our European heritage, for folks like myself and you, as these static things, but they're really not. There might be these very wide, broad strokes we can paint about French or Italian culture, but just like here in the United States, that changes very quickly when you're in an intimate relationship with it. So when you would come someplace new, those things would get very hard. There would be a very hard cutoff, and that doesn't really happen today. And
yeah.
that manifests in a bunch of different ways, which is probably a little bit outside the scope of what you wanted to talk about. But again, these are that beginning stages of those conversations, I think, are really important.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think the exciting thing is, if we treated it like they had to back then, where you're completely cut off from your culture, you have to completely adapt or be ostracized from the culture that you were moving into, how can we think about the place where we're living now as its own community with its own culture outside of what we're bringing to it? And how can we adapt? And it's a perfect transition because, as you know, I'm moving. So I live right outside New York City right now. I can see the city from my driveway. I love the connection to the urbanness where there's so many communities mushed together, and they maintain a lot of their integrity in terms of speaking a native language, eating native foods, having native restaurants, but they're mushed right up against another culture that's completely different. So they're constantly having to work together or even collaborate. So anyway, I moved to Westchester and it felt totally different in a good way. But, I live on 0.13 acres. So I'm still very close to my neighbors. They watch me watch bad reality shows at night and I watch them make dinner. And we don't have any land. Nobody has a garden. We have like a community garden in town that some industrious people work. But, now I'm moving to Connecticut on 15 acres. And that probably doesn't sound like much to you, Andy.
It's more
But,
than I have.
oh, okay. Okay. Well, and it has an organic garden, it has a lot of woodland. And I, am a fish out of water in this new, as you would call it, community. So I'll have to learn to adapt to what they're doing. But also, I really want to appreciate my new environment. Going from a postage stamp of a yard to 15 acres that's mostly forest and woodland, I want to embrace it and appreciate it and, get value out of it, not financially, but emotionally, spiritually, and regain that connection that I lost over 2 decades ago when I moved to Manhattan and hadn't seen anything bigger in terms of grass than Central Park in years.
Sure. Yeah, it's always fun and exciting and nerve-wracking to go to a new space. And especially when we're thinking about like land stewardship. And I think when we start thinking about like you're talking about these different areas, the organic garden, the forest lands, and all of these things, which all have different communities and these complex histories based on not just recent invasive species and things like that, but also the long history of colonialism and how the land had been stewarded for a number of years before colonists showed up. Now, the first thing that I recommend everyone do when they have this opportunity to go someplace new, have the opportunity to steward a piece of land that has this long and complicated history, is to just take a minute and, like you said, appreciate it and learn it. And I can tell you myself, I've got 7-ish acres here, and despite having been here now almost 4.5, almost 5 years, I will still walk around and be like, "Wow, I didn't know that tree was there." And it might not be a big tree, but you'll start to notice these things that, despite you walking through that forest every day, oh well, I didn't walk through it at this time of year. I didn't know there were ostrich ferns over there, or these other flowers that just bloom for a few weeks. Whether it's pink lady slipper or whatever it might be, you'll walk through and you'll see this thing that you've never seen before, even if you walk that trail 20, 30, 50 times. And I think as a society that we're so used to the HGTV, go in and out in 30 days and renovate a house, the idea of you've moved here, spend a year and just see all of the landscape throughout the seasons and what's
Mm.
there is really difficult. And that's, I think, one of the most important things, to learn the flowers that come up in the early spring before the leaves are out on the trees, to see what are the last things blooming on the landscape, see the way the water flows on the landscape. How does it pool in the spring when the ground starts to thaw and the snow is melting? All of those things are so important when you start thinking about, okay, where do I want to put my garden? I want to put some fruit trees in. I want to put some nut trees in. All of those things play into that, and you can't really make a good decision until you've seen, okay, this spot is a location where water builds up in the spring. I had wanted to put some fruit trees, but maybe I'll put some willows that can do really well there. And if that's the case, what willows am I going to choose? Because native willows um, are one of the most beneficial trees for our landscapes,
Mm.
in terms of the insect population that it supports. It's something like 270 different native insects rely on willows to survive, and I
Oh,
think
that's
that,
interesting.
yeah, and those things are really important to think about, because you could be at the Lowe's big box store, whatever it might be, and you see the willow tree there, and then you see the uh, I don't know, whatever, poplar, whatever it might be. Although poplar is pretty good too. Like Japanese red maple, we'll go with red maple, and that red maple that's non-native, it might support some bugs. You're going to see bugs on it, but it's not going to have the same impact as that native willow tree. That's going to support so much more diversity in life. And in that diversity, a lot more self-regulation around the things that we worry about, whether it's insects and all these other things. Having that complex web of life helps regulate things so that specific species don't go out of control.
Mm. Well, speaking of, this is a small tangent,
Sure.
but I'm a big fan. I love this idea of, not introducing foreign plants as your first go-to, right? Instead, introducing something native so that things that are already there can thrive. The thing I don't want to thrive, speaking of water and bugs, I do not want any mosquitoes on my property. I get it. I get it. They're natural life cycle. I am anti mosquito. So I was thinking of installing like a lot of bat boxes. What do you think about this strategy?
I Yeah, I think it's not a bad idea. Bats eat a lot of bugs. They're not the only thing that eats a lot of bugs too. And it's important to think about what eats the larva and where
Oh,
does the larva form, so it doesn't even get to that stage.
yeah.
So you can go down this rabbit hole, and the reality is that when you start going down the rabbit hole, you start picking apart all the different things. It's going to quickly become overwhelming because, like I said, it's this complex web that ties everything together, and in that process, reinforces and regulates all these different pieces. So that's why when invasive species come in and they don't fit into that mesh, there's nothing keeping it in check. They can do so much damage. Now,
Mm,
that doesn't mean necessarily they're bad. We have plenty of naturalized species that are, like dandelions. Dandelions are a non-native uh, grass, and they're not destroying the ecosystem or anything like
I
that.
did
They
not know
they
that.
they provide a lot of good benefits for pollinators and things like that. Plus, they make a great salad. So like the idea that you don't want any non-natives isn't necessarily the right answer, but more about
Mm,
how does this fit into a bigger picture and making that responsible decision and not trying to dissect the process in the sense of, well, like I was just saying, like, well, what eats the larva? What eats this? What eats that?
yeah, I need
If you
something that eats mosquito larvae. Come on now. Just tell me, Andy. I'm
so
going to disrupt this web. I'm just letting you know.
yeah, you can disrupt the web, it'll fight back though.
Oh, man.
So yeah, the idea is just basically, taking some meaningful steps to provide some of those keystone species, whether it's willow or oak or hickory or whatever it might be, based on the natural ecological conditions where you're at. And that's going to give you a lot of support and set that foundation for what you want to see.
Yeah. Well, and the thing about this home is it was built in the 1900s, like I think 190, I can't remember what. But my favorite thing to do is to go to the historical society the day I buy a house. That's what I did with this house, and learn the history and learn who was there and what did the landscape look like before all these other houses were there. And, was there really stucco on the outside or was it brick before? So I just love digging in, but I hadn't really thought about the history of the land because think about how long that big old tree's been there, much longer than this house. So I just love the idea of getting to intimately know everything around the house, not just what's inside the house, and thinking of that as an important characteristic of the history of the space.
Yeah, and I think it's much more interesting than or accessible than people think.
Mm.
So, you talked about like, well, there's this big old oak tree that's a couple hundred years old. All right, so now you've gone back 1800 years or to 1800 or so. All right, so do you see, and I won't go too deep into this because this is getting like kind of in the weeds, but if you know how to read the landscape, you can say that spot right there, this line of trees, that's because of a storm that happened 300 years ago. And there was a nurse tree right there that had fallen down, and I know what storm it was based on the direction the tree fell and where the
Oh my
root ball
gosh.
was. And you can go back pretty far and see this very long interesting history of what happened on that landscape hundreds of years ago. Not to plug too early, we did an episode on that, reading the forest, reading the landscape. But Tom Wessels is also a great resource out of Vermont who does a lot
Mm,
of, who's written a couple books on how you can go in the forest or even your own backyard and start to figure out what has happened over the last couple hundred years, which is really cool. Like, especially
so
if you're into
cool.
history. And I
So
mean,
cool.
and then like there's this other piece where you're in New England and there was this thing called the merino sheep craze 200 years ago, where basically the very short story is a bunch of sheep that were worth a lot of money showed up in New England. Everyone cut down every tree to put them to make room for them. 80% of New England was clear cut in
Oh my
in about
gosh.
20 years. And that obviously has left rippling effects on the landscape. And I'm sure you're familiar with the rock walls that everyone talks about in New England.
Yeah, I
This
have a lot of rock walls in Connecticut.
Yeah,
So
so
yes.
those are predominantly actually from this period, not from before.
Oh,
Like, people always say that it's from before this time, but back 400 years ago, when people were cutting down trees and starting to farm the landscape, they didn't. Rock walls are a lot of work.
yeah,
They were cutting timber, which was cheap and available, and putting up timber post fences because, like, that's quick and cheap and keeps the animals in. It was
right.
only later on, when all the trees were all gone, that they had to use the
Oh.
rocks.
That is
Uh,
fascinating because my kids and I are always like looking at these rock walls and, I'm always telling them, think about how much work, think about how heavy that rock was,
yeah,
And I really had no idea that that was kind of the impetus for rock versus wood. That's so
yeah,
interesting.
yeah, and it's all these things. You start looking at the landscape, and there's this beautiful and complicated story that exists there. And in reality, I use the term, steward a lot, because we are just a blip in that story, but we can be a really meaningful blip with the selections that we make. I mean, if you're going to go buy a house, the deal breaker isn't whether or not it was a red maple or a willow tree in the front yard, but for the ecology, it's so meaningful whether or not you're picking,
Mm,
especially those keystone species, how that affects the health of that site.
that is so interesting. Well, and I love the idea of calling yourself a steward. When I was looking for houses, only wanted a historic home because I like fitting into a timeline. And we wound up finding this house. And one thing I love about this house is it has a deep, very interesting history that the previous owners have maintained and were able to pass down to us in a story. But also, there's all these remnants on the property of other people. There's plaques inside the house. Like there's a plaque to Kenneth, there's a plaque to John, there's a plaque on the front porch reminding you that this is not your home. You are a piece of this home's fabric in terms of a quilt, but you're just one patch. And like the door knocker says Spencer for the person who built this house. And I'm not going to take it off. There have been 4 other families that lived there since, but it's an important part of that patchwork for me.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. I used to live in a very old house from the early 1800s, and had those same experiences of, as we were trying to update it, it hadn't been updated in 80, 90 years. It was due. And, what is our responsibility as owners of this house that's a very old colonial? Even if it's not necessarily my aesthetic, I have a responsibility to keep the general integrity of the house and what it represents to exist as it does, and not to go in with, for example, a super modern kitchen and all these other things, even if that is what I like, because I've just negated these generations of people that have lived here, and the interests of the house itself as its own, uh, I guess, like, sovereign thing that exists on the earth, whether or not I'm there. Just like I'm not there anymore, and it still stands at least I left it, to
Right,
be
right.
somewhat representative of that time where it came from.
Well, and people who listen to the podcast have probably heard me say this, but I'll share sort of my thoughts with you. Sometimes you buy a house that doesn't fit your style, right? Because of maybe the location where you're wanting to move or your price point or whatever. But I do feel like, say you are moving in with your partner, there's actually 3 people that are going to live there: you, your partner, and the house. And just as your partner would get a say in, hey, I want the room to do this, I want to have a sectional, I want to put my TV here, the architecture of the home gets a say. And if you do something that's super counterintuitive to the architecture, super incongruous with what's already going on, or the native sort of vibe of the house, it's not going to feel quite right. So, sure, you can do it, right? And maybe you should do it to put your own stamp on things. But it's just like when you go against your partner or just negate what they have to say and do what you want, it's not quite working for everyone. And so you want to think about everybody when you're making design choices: you, your partner, and the structure itself. It has a say whether you like it or not. And it's
Yeah.
going to tell you based on the flow, based on just the way things work and the way things look, if you made the right choice or not.
Yeah, and you know
So
the
we can,
landscape does the same thing. You know, to
mm,
continue that metaphor,
yeah.
like I was saying, whether or not you put a willow there, why would you put a willow versus an oak tree if you're concerned about natives? Well, look at the landscape. What kind of soil do you have? What's the pH? How wet, how dry is it? How sandy is it? All of these different things are going to tell you, even if you put that tree in the ground, is it even going to survive? It's going to dictate basically within, you know, a margin of error what's going to be successful there and what's the right species for where you are. And that goes back to understanding how to read that landscape and understanding, like I said, to go back to the example I used, if you can tell a tree fell here 200 years ago and all these trees came up from it, that gives you an idea what species were around and dropping seeds to know what would have been there and kind of how that landscape naturally regenerates and how that might guide your decisions about, okay, you know what, oaks are really great. They're important. I've got a bunch of oak trees. What else would have been in an oak forest here? Is this an oak hickory biome? And if it is, then where are all the hickories? Maybe that's my job, my responsibility as the steward to incorporate species that would have been here 200 years ago, that whether it was indigenous people or without any guidance, that these would have been the species that would have been here. And it's my responsibility to recognize that and do what I can to bring that landscape back to its full vigor.
Mm. Well, and one question, you mentioned the pH of the soil, you'd mentioned learning the history. For us novices, I'm a total novice. How do we determine what the pH is and what these different things are? I have egg on my face, but when I moved to this house, which was also old and had amazing stories, I wanted this certain type of tree. I just wanted it. And I went online. I was like, okay, we get that kind of sun. I think this will be good. I clicked and bought it on some kind of website. And within 2 weeks, it was dead. Right. And it came and it had like little leaves and stuff. It was so promising. And I felt I'd failed this tree, but I didn't care about the history. I didn't know about pH of soil. I probably set it up for failure from the start. How do we figure these things out?
So there's a number of things you can do, and it depends on how invested you want to be in it, really. So you don't
Mildly
necessarily,
invested, very
yeah.
mild.
So mildly, so say you don't want to spend a lot of money. You're willing to do some time, but you don't want to spend any money. The first thing is you can do a soil sample, which is literally just dig up some soil and send it to a lab. Most states have extension schools that offer pretty cheap-ish soil assessments. Um, the alternative is to just look at what's growing naturally there and look up, you know, if you say you're in a suburban neighborhood or a rural suburban neighborhood, what are the trees that are in the woods?
I wanted
Y-
something totally different. I got like this blue flowering willow. It was going to be so different. There's nothing blue for miles. Maybe that's should have been my first clue.
Well, yeah, I mean, willow is also really demanding in terms of, again, the sandiness of the soil. So if you have clay soils, they're not going to do well.
Mm,
And it's easy not to know that when you're digging in your front yard because you know they bring in topsoil, so you have nice grass and all of these things. So it can be really hard to know what that the soil beneath the native soil is, and those roots will find out pretty quickly.
mm.
And so the first thing I would say, like I said, is to look around at what's around you and what species. You know, you're coming to New England, you can narrow that down pretty quickly. Um, Looking at the water table, do you have wetlands? Are there places that kind of, you know, fill in when that spring rains come in and the ground's still frozen? You know, look for the spots that you can see. Are there ferns around? You know, all the different species that might point to specific types of environments that you can start to narrow a little bit of, okay, these are the species that live in this one place, and that means like this is my collection of species that because I have X, Y, and Z, I can also integrate, and they'll do well because they're a part of that family, that community, that biome. And that can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be. You can get you know, one of those Peterson's field guides, Forests of North America, any of those types of books, and those will be broken out by those biomes, and you can quickly see, okay, I live in XYZ area. It's going to be one of these 3 or 4 types of ecosystems. What species are around me? And then you're going to know pretty quickly, okay, these species all do well in soil pH of XYZ, wetlands or drylands. Now I know what I have got to work with, what fits into that I want to plant.
Yeah. Yeah. Set yourself up for success because I lost $89 in 3 weeks. And hopes and dreams, and I dug my own hole, which was not easy. It's not easy to dig a hole. But the other thing I'm excited about moving to this big property is that I can have some space to breathe. And I was listening to this Tim Ferriss podcast, and he was talking about forest bathing, which I think is there's like a Japanese kind of philosophy about, walking through nature regularly as a way to meditate and ground yourself and get back to, as you were mentioning before, how we lived, hundreds of years ago versus just a couple hundred years ago. So what's your thought on forest bathing? Are you a bather?
I'm not a bather. I spend a lot of time in the forest, though. I think it's just a term to get people interested in doing things that we've done traditionally. There's numerous case studies done on people going into natural settings and having documented medical improvements, whether it's stress or, heartbeat rates and things like that, that show that being in nature is very calming. And that makes sense. As much as we try to pretend, we are natural creatures that belong out in the woods or in the prairie, more specifically like the Savannah prairie. So to not be in that 24 hours a day is no different than putting a lion in a zoo. We're just very malleable species that are incredibly good at living in like a diversity of conditions, and I think we've used that to our detriment to stick ourselves in these cities and boxes that we forget that that's not where we're supposed to be. And some people are afraid of leaving that at this point, and that's
Totally.
that comes with its own set of issues and challenges.
Well, I loved my skyscraper cage. I didn't know I was in the zoo of Manhattan, but it's so funny because I'm feeling really. When we were looking to buy a house, I didn't want 15 acres. Like I was like, this seems like a burden. I love this house; it's perfect, but 15 acres is so intimidating. I don't even want it. And then I was talking to my real estate agent. She's like, you could sell some of it back to the city or whatever you want to do. And then I was thinking, I was like, I do want it. What if I just like explore 15 acres? What if I just walk around and find some stuff and become a different person? So I'm excited to think of it as more of a return to myself than a departure from myself. So I like this idea of thinking about, the urban cage versus my native habitat.
Yeah, and there's going to be a lot of opportunities for you to rediscover things. And I don't think, I think about like, we stick our kids in school for 12 years, not including kindergarten and college, and it's like, all right, you've got these basic skills so you can navigate the world we live in, and that's great and fine. But historically, that would have been time learning with our parents. What can you eat? What can't you eat? What does this mean in the ecosystem around us? Is this a good or bad thing? How do we steward this land? And that same developmental time was still used to develop skills. So the idea that you go into a forest or again, a prairie or whatever it might be, and that you're going to learn all this stuff just because it's in a book or you've bought some books and you're going to learn it in a couple of years is like laughable. Like this is humans spent their entire lives learning how to manage and steward lands, and we're starting in many cases at 30, at 40. So that means you're probably going to spend the rest of your life still learning, just in your local ecosystem. And that's like exciting and cool that you can go someplace and learn something new every single day. And you can just go down a rabbit hole. You see some cool mushrooms and suddenly you're reading about mushrooms, and you could spend a year or two doing that and still just scratch the surface. And then you see a salamander and suddenly you're learning about salamanders. And like it never really ends, which is just somewhat comforting for me at least.
Well, guys, if you're listening and you're feeling like it's comforting to you, here's my strategy. Watch Alone. Listen. Do you watch Alone, Andy?
I don't know what that is.
Oh my gosh. Where they drop these people in different outdoor environments and they have to survive using only 10
Okay,
tools.
yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
my
I've
gosh.
heard of it.
Yeah, so just watch Alone because now I feel like a true nature expert after watching all 7 seasons. I didn't even have to leave my house, and I didn't even have to look at a tree in real life, and I learned so much. Andy's rolling his eyes inside. And then, so watch Alone, definitely. Go out there and forest bathe. But the real thing you'll want to do is catch Andy's podcast. So, Andy, tell us where people can find you, where they can get legitimate information, where they can take those deep dives and go down those rabbit holes, because this is so fascinating to me. And I'm sure once I'm actually in the environment, I'll get even more excited, intrigued, curious.
Yeah, and the best thing about doing it is then bringing the community in to do it and building that
Mm.
community and learning from that community. And that can be as simple as who is selling mushrooms at the farmers market, because they're probably not, they might be growing them, but they might not be. And if they're not, they can probably help you out a lot, and they'll probably be happy to come eat some of your mushrooms if they can get some for free.
Somebody's got
And
to use my organic garden. This big old organic garden. I'm not getting near it for a couple of years. It's overwhelming. Somebody's got to farm it. Would somebody want to farm my organic garden in Connecticut?
yeah, maybe. And that's how you build your community, connect with people. And that's, I think, the part that gets missing sometimes. You talked about alone. We have this obsession with the idea that like you're going to be self-sufficient, you individually or you and your family. And historically, that's never been the case.
Mm.
And I think people realize that when they move to 15 acres and they say, I'm going to farm all my own food and do all these things. And they realize there's no way to do it. There's not enough time in the day. People specialize in things because they're good at them and they can do them efficiently, and they can build the value of scale in doing things quickly. And that's okay. We aren't supposed to be able to do everything.
Well, and
And
spoiler alert, the number one reason why they fail at alone, why they like tap out, number one reason is because they get lonely. They miss community. It's like totally outside of a comfort zone to be that alone for that long. We need each other.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Not just for being good at things like collecting dandelions or whatever it might be, but also because we're a social species. We're made to do this right here, talk and explore our different opinions and thoughts on things and just exist together.
And learn from each other. I have learned so much from you today.
Well, thank
And
you.
I've listened to a couple episodes, but now I need to go back and listen to a lot more. So tell us where we can hear
Sure.
more from you.
Yeah. So the podcast is the Poor Proles Almanac. You can find it at wherever you're listening to this podcast. Our website is poorproles.com. We also have an Instagram handle. I do not recommend it. It's terrible. We also do, though, have a second Instagram handle called PPA Sites. Now, PPA Sites, SITES, is basically what you're looking for. The idea is to create a basic key for people that say, I am interested in doing something for my local ecology, but I don't know anything. So, how do I go from I don't know what an oak tree looks like to these are some native flowers that I want to plant in the ground without having to understand botany? And the idea is, okay, here are some basic skills, kind of like what we just talked about. How do you figure out where you are, what's important for your local site, what would naturally be there, what could naturally be there, and how do I do this in the most basic way possible where I can help a site regenerate and eventually be less hands-on, where I don't want to be stewarding it all the time. I don't want to be
Totally.
weeding. I don't want to do all these different things. How do I get out of doing that but still doing something good? And that's what the PPA Sites Instagram is. It's also ppasites.org. And again, that's SITES. And you can, it's still in the early stages. It's only been around for about a month. But the general idea is basically what I just talked through with you about how to figure out what to plant that's native and how to know what's native to where you are, not down the street.
Yeah. Well, I'm so excited. I'm going to check that out. Sounds like Cliff Notes for the eco curious, and that's me.
Basically, yeah. I love that.
Yeah.
I'm going to call it that from now on. Sorry.
There we
Stealing
go.
it.
There we go. Well, I am your target client, I think. So I am definitely going to go check that out. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your philosophies, your ideas with us. It certainly has opened my mind and made me even more excited to move to Connecticut.
Awesome. Betsy, this has been great.
Thank you, Andy.
Have a
And
good
thank
one.
you, everyone, for listening. We'll be in touch very soon. See you next week. A big thank you to Aton and the Embassy, who wrote our theme song. A shout out to Catherine Heller, who owns the podcast shop and is our editor extraordinaire. We also want to thank Ginny Sunasan and her team at the Savvy Podcast Agency for their help with our social, our YouTube channel, and so much more. We also want to thank Uploft, which is our parent company who supports this podcast. And lastly, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to you. Thank you so much for tuning in and for all your support.